So who is that guy in an old stamp from 1950s? And that lady on a poster for an opera? And wait, is that John Wayne in Japan and now Tom Cruise in Japan? You gotta explain to me everything. Well, that's what we're gonna do today as we explore the history of Japan from the time of the Tokugawas on the cusp of the modern era. Stay tuned. In the past couple of videos, we have asked ourselves how come some countries in Asia were not the ones that became world leaders in the 15th, 16th, and 1700s. We looked at places like Turkey, India, and China that all had large empires behind them, some amount of technological and military superiority coming into the modern era, and then somehow squandered it largely due to their political leadership. Today we'll have a similar story. It's in Japan, a country that is not as large or as powerful as, say, China next to it in the 15th, 16th, or 1700s, but was roughly the size of Britain, the same kind of archipelago. In a way, if Britain came to dominate the world, Japan could have. So how come they did not? Well, a lot of it has to do with a very top-down kind of leadership that was adverse to risk. The traditional society of Japan that emerged out of the Genpei War in the 1180s would start with an emperor at the top. Those emperors may have been of Korean descent, but that's not something Japanese people like to hear. So according to the Japanese, they are descendants of the sun goddess, Amaterasu. Second in command and wielding effective power would be the shogun. And there have been different dynasties with shoguns in the history of Japan. The current ones for our time period would be the Tokugawa shogun, from 1603 to 1867. That's the Tokugawa era of Japan. Tokugawa shogun would be a bit like a prime minister in Britain today, one who wields effective day-to-day power, while the monarch is more a respected figurehead. Beyond that, there would also be the general-in-chief of the army. One notch below would be the various daimyos, that would be kind of like provincial governors in all the various provinces of Japan. Quite independent. They would have their own castles, their own army, administer justice, a bit like medieval lords in medieval Europe. In fact, that system was very feudal, similar to what existed in Europe in the Middle Ages. Below those daimyos would be their army, composed of the famous samurai, and that's the one part of the hierarchy that you already knew about, the samurai, the Japanese equivalent to a medieval knight. So up to that point, we're dealing with nobility, people who don't work with their hands, that are more about administering and fighting in the case of the samurai. Below, you get to the vast bulk of the population, those who work, specifically rice farmers. Japan had introduced a lot of the theories from China, the Confucian philosophy, and by those standards, the peasants would be considered quite important because they produced the food that kept you alive. Below with that would be craftsmen who also work with their hands, but we see that were slightly less useful, like tools and the like, not actual food, still quite respected. And at the bottom of society would be people like merchants and so forth that were considered non-producers because they worked in the service industry, did not do anything tangible with their hands. So that's a society as it was supposed to function, especially after the Genpei War in the 1180s, and it worked for several hundred years. But it kind of broke down in the 1500s because the previous dynasty of shoguns got embroiled in a civil war, and then you have various factions vying for power in the 1500s. That period is known as the period of warring states, which is very exciting for storytellers and movie makers. If you're familiar with the works of Akira Kurosawa, or I think the Japanese pronunciation is closer to Akira Kurosawa or something like that. This is usually the time when these movies are set because, well, it's exciting. You have various factions vying for power and plenty of openings for great storytelling, such as his famous movie The Seven Samurai, which was hugely influential in American cinema, or Yojimbo, Hidden Castle, Ran. He's made a lot of great samurai movies. If you're not a movie maker, however, this is a terrible period to be in because the whole world collapses around you. And so when the period of the warring states finally ended, those who came out on top, and that would be the new line of shoguns, the Tokugawas that would roll up until the modern era in Japan, had to ask themselves, how do we prevent another period of warring states, another civil war, and for us to be overthrown. So there's a very big focus on stability at the expense of everything else that would denote Japan later on. For example, how do you deal with the daimyos not being loyal to you, all these provincial lords with their private armies? What if they turn against the shogun? So what do you do, for example, with the castle of those daimyos? If there are multiple of them, they could defend themselves in the case of rebellion. So what you had was the one castle policy, that they would only be allowed to have one castle in their provincial capital because they have to live in style, but everything else would have to be destroyed. This way, if one daimyo ever revolted, then the army of the shogun would show up, go through the defenses of the provinces undefended, and then show up right there on your home castle and attack you if need be. Another thing that was practiced would be the Sankin Kotai system, which translates roughly as the hostage-taking system, where the family of the daimyos might have extended stays in the capital with the shogun, and then every year or so the daimyos would show up at the capital to renew their homage to the shogun and the emperor, and in the process, well, maybe get to see their wife and kids for a bit, and then return alone to the provinces. This way, if they ever revolted, they knew exactly what would happen. One step below where the samurai are, how do you get those people to stay in check? Well, for one thing, you have to teach them proper values, and that's where the famous Bushido comes into practice. Bushido translates as the way of the warrior. It's the code of honor of the samurai. Many of the stories in there go back to the Genpei War even before, but they're put in writing in the 1600s as part of the Agakure, which became almost like a manual for samurai. Stories from the old Japan of famous samurai and how they had behaved and how you should do the same. So one of the advice is when you wake up in the morning, think about all the ways that you could die. Drowned in tsunami, burned by a volcano, killed in an earthquake, impaled, burnt alive, and spend half an hour meditating, and then you have breakfast. And if you spend every day thinking about the very many ways that you could die, then when the time of death comes along, you'll be at peace. And that's what is a samurai. You're not afraid of death. And if for any reason you fail to live up to those expectations, what do? Well, that's where the famous arakiri or seppuku, suicide or belly cutting, comes into play. This might seem a bit archaic, but some of these values continued quite a bit up until 1912. I think that's the last case that we have of a servant of the emperor killing himself when the emperor disappeared. So samurai are going to follow orders. What you have below, well, you have the peasants and the like. The orders that were set up in the Tokugawa period were to confiscate the swords, what they call the sword hunt, so that all the weapons that the peasants accumulated during the period of warring states to defend themselves would be confiscated from them, and then you have a monopoly on violence attributed to the knights and above, the samurai and above, and the population cannot resist. So you combine all that and you have a more stable society, which is the goal of the Tokugawas. You still have some problems. Some samurai are without a master. They're called the ronin, R-O-N-I-N, also a frequent feature in different movies. So what do you do with the ronins? In a way, they are dishonorable because these are people who have no master to serve, and that's the primary duty of a samurai. And if they have no master, it means they were fired or the master got killed. There is something wrong about them. And worst of all, they're still alive, so they've been killed themselves when something went wrong. Because the only training that they had was a military training, all they could do was make money through violence by being highway robbers and the like. So that's a problem also in society, that you have ronins lying around. In parallel with the official samurai, and also an order that can be problematic, the famous ninjas that you'll see a lot in the movies, also known as shinobi, those who are hidden or something of that nature. Some of the members of the established order might employ them for assassination and the like, but generally they are seen more as a nuisance. So that's always a fear for the Tokugawas, that the society that is just on the verge of exploding, and you always have those reasons to try to prevent violence by outsiders and keep things the way they are. One change that did show up in Japan in the 1600s, just around the time when the Tokugawas were coming along, is the European age of exploration. That Portuguese explorers and later Dutch explorers show up in India, later on China, and then as far as Japan. And when they came for two reasons, either God or gold. In both cases, that might create some issues. If you are a merchant and you sell things like guns, a more modern weaponry that is now produced in Europe, muskets, modern cannons, and the like, and you sell them, usually they went to the western reaches of Japan, around, say, Nagasaki. then that means that the daimyos in that area might have access to more modern weaponry, which would allow them to revolt against the Tokugawas, and you see where that's going, a new period of warring states. That's very threatening. What about the missionaries? Well, they don't come with guns, but they come with powerful ideas, Catholic Christianity. And they did quite a few converts in the western part of Japan. If you're interested, there's a fairly recent movie by Martin Scorsese called Silence, which is specifically about that period. It's a bit of a long movie, like the later movies by Martin Scorsese, but if you can watch it at 2 times the speed, it's a very great movie. So what would happen if those missionaries gain converts, as they do? Well, it's an issue because their thought is a foreign one, and one that is monotheistic, whereas the traditional religion of Japan is polytheistic, so you have to reject all the other gods of Japan. And in the Shinto religion, you have respect for the emperor, who himself is considered to be the descendant of a goddess. And if you convert to Christianity, you reject all these gods and goddesses, and you essentially assimilate the Japanese emperor to a fraud, that he's lying about his divine ancestry. So you could see how worshipping a different god might be seen as a form of treason to the emperor. So what did the Tokugawa shoguns do? Well, they came along and issued what were called the exclusion edicts. And if you scour the internet, you should be able to find a copy of those exclusion edicts. As the title indicates, it's an edict, so kind of a law passed by a shogun or an emperor, and to exclude foreigners. So it told the Portuguese merchants that they simply could not come to Japan, and Portuguese missionaries that they could not come to Japan. So you have a wave of persecution of all the converts to Christianity, and that's what the movie Silence is mostly about. Beyond that, there's also a ban on foreign commerce, with some exceptions. Dutch merchants were allowed under very strict rules to come parts of the year to sell certain goods in certain ports like Nagasaki, but that's kind of an exception to the norm. By and large, foreign merchants were excluded from Japan. So that's the solution of the Tokugawa emperors. If foreign influences are going to change things to Japan and change is bad, let's create a bubble around Japan and ignore the rest of the world. Think of it as an ostrich that puts its head in the sand, or your 3-year-old that's saying that if you just hide your eyes, then nothing wrong will happen to you, because if you can't see the world can't see you. So such was the policy embraced by the Tokugawas, which in a way are reminiscent of some of the policies that we've seen in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, the Mughal Empire in India, or the Qing Empire in China, which is to put a premium on internal stability, order, at the expense of maybe in the long run adapting to the modern world, hiding yourself from the world of the barbarians. Because if you have a society that is frozen in time, well, the rest of the world doesn't stop, it continues evolving. And so by the 1800s, you have a situation where countries like Britain or the US had undergone an industrial revolution and now had access to steamships, modern weaponry, and were miles ahead of Japan. Japan being still stuck in the feudal order of samurai fighting with swords and bows and arrows and horses and sailing ships and castles, as if they were partying like in 1344. Well, that can only last so long. And so the man you saw on the stamp, his name was Commodore Perry, P-E-R-R-Y, and he showed up in 1853 in Japan with a fleet from the US and a letter from the US president saying, we would love to open a relationship with Japan. I know the exclusion edict prevent that from happening, but we want to. And by the way, Mr. Perry came with a very large fleet, modern weaponry, and I think you don't have that. And Japan is an archipelago where the bulk of the population lives in cities by the sea, so it might be an issue if my guns started to destroy all your coastal settlements. The Japanese were very unwilling to open themselves to the world, but under threat of gunboat diplomacy, signed a treaty opening Japan to the world. That event, Commodore Perry expedition, is one that is barely remembered in the US, but is very, very well known in Japan because it is one of those defining moments where Japan escaped the medieval era and then was pushed kicking and screaming into the modern world, forced to open itself to foreign commerce. In the end, and we'll have another video about that, they did quite well. They ditched the world of the samurai, and that's where Tom Cruise came in, and eventually adapted to the modern world and became a leading exporter of goods to the point where it became a problem in the US in the 1980s, where too many Japanese goods were sold in the US. But going back to the 1850s, it was the other way around. The US was a willing exporter to Japan, and Japan was very reluctant. It was a national trauma for them. So what happened after the Commodore Perry expedition in Japan? More expeditions were sent, negotiating more treaties, and it was difficult for Japan to fight back because they didn't have the proper weaponry. So they tried to use a bit of a trickery in that sense. They went to see a lady called Okichi, O-K-I-C-H-I, and told her she should be seducing the American consul, Townsend Harris was his name, so that she could become his mistress, gain access to his heart, and then influence him in terms of the diplomatic negotiations that were going on. The stories about Okichi are difficult to get right because there's a lot of myths about her, and when you do research you realize that different stories are conflicting. So I'll give you the best I could figure out, but some of it might be inaccurate and not reflective of the past. Supposedly she was a geisha trained in sexual art. Supposedly she was also engaged to a person of her interest, but was forced to abandon her lover, the man of her heart, to do the duty and to put the needs of the state above her own. And so she became the mistress. Her story is one that made her way into Western literature and art. So Puccini had an opera that is inspired by her story, Madame Butterfly. And if you look at the more modern era, you have a movie with John Wayne, Barbarian and a Geisha. In her case, she did her job right, managed to influence the treaty in a way that was more favorable to Japan, and then the Consul Harris came back to the US. And then, well, that's the way men are, kind of left her and ditched her. She was seen as a woman who had prostituted herself to a foreigner, and the very example of how Japan had been humiliated during that period. So she was shunned by others, she took to drinking and drinking some more, and eventually she killed herself by throwing herself into a well, if my memory serves me right. She has become a bit of an icon in Japan now. People have recovered her and treat her almost as she was a spirit in the Shinto religion, goddess of Japan's opening to the world, if you want to put it that way. So here's the situation as of the late 19th century. Japan in a period of crisis, bullied by gunboat diplomacy by the US. More countries came in and asked similar treaties, the Germans, the French, and others. And then they requested extraterritoriality rights, which means that foreigners living in Japan would not be subjected to Japanese law. And that's the kind of path that you had seen in other countries like China and others in the region, which typically would lead to, after that, foreign powers demanding an actual concession, like a whole area of a city and then an entire city like Hong Kong, and ultimately colonizing the whole place like, say, in Vietnam. So that was a great risk where Japan was by the late 19th century, having failed to modernize, having failed to adapt to the modern world. They were at a point where they were at risk of disappearing as a nation. So that kind of goes a long way toward answering the question we started off with. How come Japan did not become the Great Britain in the 19th century? Because of a leadership that was more interested in self-preservation than change and economic development. So we have also answered all the very important question that we started off with. Who is that lady on the opera? That's Okichi. Who is that man on the stamp? That's Commodore Perry. Is that John Wayne in that movie? Yes. Is that Tom Cruise? Yes. We now know all these answers.